This film will explain what the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, was doing in France and Belgium between August and November 1914, while some of Kitchener's volunteers for his new armies were being trained here in the Wylye Valley. And by the way, there were to be 5 of these new armies, each of 100,000. The background to the formation of the BEF. Anglo-French Army staff talks had started in 1906, and they were the beginning of our involvement on the continent should a war with Germany break out. These talks followed the successful initiation by Edward VII 2 years early of the Entente Cordiale. By 1911, these talks had resulted in a plan for landing of an expeditionary force in France and for its concentration in the area of Marbourg and Le Cateau. But there was no treaty or solid agreement to send a force of any size anywhere. You may wish to note that in 1906 Haldane had also started his much-needed reform of the army. This eventually led in 1914 to a regular army about 250,000 strong, almost half of which was spread around the empire. This was backed up by, first, a reserve of 147,000 ex-regulars, most of whom were called up and went to France with the BEF in August 1914. Secondly, by a special reserve of 64,000 men who were civilian volunteers, who had done 6 months training, topped up by 2 weeks a year. The majority were in France within 6 months of the war's start. And finally, by the territorial force, with an establishment of 300,000, but which was only recruited to roughly 245,000. These were civilians who did a few weeks training each year with their unit. It was not well trained and its equipment was often obsolete. It was primarily for home defence. This force was formed into 14 divisions and 14 mounted brigades of yeomanry. This is a tiny force, about 700,000 after mobilisation, compared with those of France and Germany. France had a peacetime army of about 740,000, inflated on mobilisation to roughly 3.78 million. Germany's totals were 880,000 in peace and 4.5 million after mobilisation. Both these armies were much better prepared for a continental war. Our army, on the other hand, had a higher priority: to be ready to deploy anywhere around the empire, to desert, mountain or jungle, and against a variety of opponents. Haldane had a census taken of all horses in Britain and obtained statutory powers for their requisition and of motor vehicles when needed. Kitchener had become Secretary of State for War on 6th of August, i.e. 2 days after it had been declared. He unfortunately, in June 1916, was to go down with HMS Hampshire when she was mined off the west coast of Orkney when he was on the way to staff talks in Russia. We should now look at the composition of the BEF in 1914. When it deployed to France in early August, it was about 100,000 strong and consisted of 4 infantry divisions and 1 of cavalry. The French initially deployed 62 infantry and 10 of cavalry, and the German armies in the west included 81 infantry and 10 cavalry divisions. And now we come to the nitty-gritty, the composition of each of our infantry divisions. 18,000 all ranks, of whom 12,000 were infantry and 4,000 gunners. Each division was broken down into 3 brigades, and each brigade had 4 battalions, and each battalion had 4 companies, and each company had 4 platoons, each of up to 46 men. The division had 5,500 horses, 24 machine guns, Vickers or Maxims, at 2 per battalion, and by 1918 this had increased to 64 Vickers and 336 light machine guns, the lowest. The division also had 76 guns, 54 18-pounders, 18 4.5-inch howitzers and 4 60-pounders. The last, by 1916, had been withdrawn into artillery formations. The division also had a cavalry squadron and a cyclist company, but these were withdrawn in 1915. It had a divisional pioneer or infantry battalion, which was added in late 14 to assist with simple things like digging and constructing of trenches, rather than employing the fighting infantry battalions or the Royal Engineers on these tasks. And also the division had supporting troops like engineers, signallers, field ambulances and supply columns. This all took up 15 miles of road. In early 1918, due to manpower shortages, brigades were reduced from 4 to 3 battalions. Our cavalry division comprised 9,000 all ranks, 10,000 horses, 24 machine guns, and 24 13-pounder field guns of the sort you see firing salutes in Hyde Park, and it had the usual supporting troops. And strangely enough, the French and German divisions were really quite similar to ours. Let's have a quick look at the BEF. It was a comparatively small force, as we shall see in a minute, but it was an efficient professional one, thanks, you could say, to its Boer War experience and Haldane's reforms. But it did have some weaknesses. For example, reservists made up about 40% of its strength, and its headquarters, GHQ, did not even exist pre-war, being only temporarily formed for annual exercises. Likewise, the administrative services, i.e. those that would bring up supplies to the BEF in France, they existed only on paper until mobilisation. At corps level, the 3 corps headquarters, only one of those existed before the war, and the other 2 had to be put together pretty quickly. The divisional headquarters, they only had 2 officers, staff officers, on their peacetime strength, and therefore 4 more for each had to be found to bring them up to war establishment. Let us now look at the order of battle of the BEF when it went across to France in August. Now there's a lot of detail here, and it's only put in for those who are fond of the glories of the old army with its magnificent county regiments. A few points of interest. The Cavalry Division's commander, Allenby. He was known for his explosively foul temper, but he was also highly efficient because he became an army commander at BEF before being sent to Palestine to command our forces there fighting the Turks. A quick word about the British cavalry of World War I. It has been much derided, but in fact it was much better than the French or German, and this was because it had comparatively recent experience from the Boer War. It was equipped and trained to fight dismounted as infantry, and frequently did so, as well as to charge with steel, as it did on occasions, mainly at the beginning and end of the war. Furthermore, it was armed with the infantry's rifle rather than the shorter range carbine, and took their musketry courses. And lastly, it wore khaki uniform rather than colourful ones. It did not wear breastplates or funny hats. You can see that 3 Corps was formed on the 30th of August, but its 19th Infantry Brigade, formed on the 19th, would have been at Le Cateau, and so would its 4th Division, which, having arrived in France 22nd and 23rd, would have literally jumped off the train and gone straight to the battlefield. And then its 6th Division, 6th Infantry Division, which had arrived in France 9th to 10th September, that would have got to the Aisne, the Battle of the Aisne, something like halfway through it. Now let's cover briefly the initial deployments of the Germans, French and the BEF. The Germans invaded Belgium on the 4th of August 1914 according to the famous Schlieffen Plan. Now Schlieffen had been chief of the German General Staff from 1890 to 1905, and his plan had been under development since 1892. In fact, this plan was never accepted by the Germans. It was only contained in a memorandum Schlieffen wrote just before he retired for the benefit of his successor, but it was all the Germans had. It had a strong right or west wing aimed in the direction of Paris, to pass west or east of it depending on the version of the plan. However, the German CNC in 1914, Moltke, had made changes to this plan. He had reduced the ratio of the strength of his right wing to his left from 7-1 to about 4-1 as a temporary measure, intending to transfer reinforcements by train from left to right. This he could not do until too late, owing to the destruction by the Belgians of their railway system. And he sent 2 corps to East Prussia to help counter the Russian invasion. Also, it seems that he did not appreciate the early information we would have of his moves from aerial reconnaissance, which was then in its infancy. And finally, he didn't seem to have considered how easily the French could counter his moves by moving their forces by rail, while his forces had to march. The French response was the disastrously expensive Plan 17, a broad front counter-offensive along the Franco-German border, losing 27,000 dead on 22nd of August alone during the Ardennes offensive. They used out-of-date tactics. The BEF, consisting of regulars and reservists, but no territorial force units, had by the 20th been moved efficiently by rail to an area south of Mons, between Marburg and Le Cateau, as shown by this map of the concentration of the armies. We now come to the most significant part of this film: the movement and engagements of the BEF, its neighbouring French armies and opposing German ones between August and November 1914. This map shows the advance of the 1st and 2nd German armies, the ones we are interested in, between 4th and the 22nd of August, the eve of the Battle of Mons, and the locations of opposing forces on the 22nd. On the 23rd, the Germans closed up to the Mons Canal from east to west, with the intention to cross it. Only our 2nd Corps was heavily engaged in preventing them. A German account of their attack goes: well entrenched and completely hidden, the enemy opened a murderous fire. Our casualties increased, our rushes became shorter, and finally the whole advance stopped. With bloody losses, the attack gradually came to an end. This account reflects the high standard of the BEF as a result of the Boer War experience. The all-important advance of the powerful German right wing had been delayed a day. The Belgian defence of Liège and Namur had caused further delays, and all these delays were significant because the Schlieffen plan had anticipated knocking France out of the war within 42 days. But now the French Fifth Army to the east of the BEF was forced to retire to prevent being outflanked from the east. So on the evening of the 23rd, and in the face of superior forces, the BEF started its retirement. The Germans followed up, and there were some sharp engagements with our rearguards, but none of these disrupted our withdrawal, although they cost us 1,650 casualties, about 1,000 more than at Mons. The retreat from Mons to the Marne, 23rd of August to the 5th of September. What you can now see on the map is the country between Mons and the Marne, near to which, and just to the southeast of Paris, the BEF's retreat came to an end. The route of the BEF's retreat from Mons and that of neighbouring French formations will now be shown and major developments explained. During the 17 days, the 20th of August to the 5th of September, much of the BEF had advanced to Mons, fought there and at Le Cateau, and had retreated to the Marne. This was a distance of between 150 and 250 miles, depending on the formation. The men were desperately tired from their recent experience and from, of course, retreating day after day. They were often very hungry because supplies could not be got up to them, and possibly worst of all, horribly thirsty because the weather was absolutely scorching. Now, the reservists, who made up almost 50% of the force, they suffered most severely. In many cases, you can imagine, they just come out of their offices and their feet are soft. Nevertheless, the BEF maintained its cohesion, which is exemplary. And the retreat actually been made harder, really, because it was knocked down to BEF's line of communication, which ran away southwest to Rouen and Le Havre. Instead, it was more or less due south. Therefore, it was more hard to supply them. And can you imagine it? Trying to bring up supplies to a force, the location of which you don't really know, in a foreign land, with a team which had just been put together, and with inadequate maps. It must have been a nightmare. The start of the retreat, evening of the 23rd to night of 24th August. The retreat was contested, particularly two corps. You can see the locations for the night of 25th August, the eve of the Battle of Cateau. The BEF had intentionally become separated. Rather than attempt to retire through the forest of Montmal, a corps went either side. Two corps had been hard pressed from the north and the northwest. Our troops were exhausted from the march to Mons, the fighting there, the fighting withdrawal, particularly on the western side, as the Germans tried to outflank the BEF, the stifling heat, lack of food and water, delays caused by congestion on the roads, and footsore, particularly from the cobbled roads. The BEF was still really the left of the Allied line. French forces further west were only a cavalry corps on our immediate left and 6 divisions from there to the sea. Le Cateau, 26th of August. This battle was fought by 2 corps, reinforced by much of the cavalry division and by the newly arrived 4 Division and 19 Brigade, both soon to be part of the new 3 Corps, and with much support from the French on our left. 1 Corps was not involved. Orders for the continuing retreat of all the BF had been given, but Smith-Dorrien, GOC 2 Corps, decided his force was too exhausted and pressed by the enemy to retire immediately, and therefore he would stand his ground, fight, delay the Germans, and then continue the withdrawal. For the first 6 hours their position held, although it is in danger of being outflanked south of Le Cateau on the right, which it had been hoped would be covered by 1 Corps. By the evening all the 2 Corps forces were continuing the retreat, roughly southwest, having delayed the Germans without much molestation and in reasonable order. 1 Corps, after a comparatively uneventful day, also retired, but due south. Hence, an 18-mile gap opened between the 2 corps of the BEF. After Le Cateau on the 26th, von Bülow, who commanded the German First Army as well as his own Second Army until the 27th of August, ordered pursuit in a southwesterly direction. He had little idea of where the BEF was and believed it to be retiring on the Channel ports. The retreat, 27th to 29th of August. The BEF continued its retreat as shown and with little interference, as the gap between the 2 German armies opened to 14 miles. These 2 armies were both now pretty exhausted and certainly much weaker than intended in Schlieffen's plan. The French Fifth Army on the BEF's right continued its retirement on the 27th, but on the 28th it swung to the west to attack the flank of Bülow's Second Army. This French attack took place on the 29th, the Battle of Guise. It caused the German Second Army to turn to fight and further delayed its advance. General Joffre, in order to make his attack at Guise more effective, had asked that Haig's 1 Corps would participate in the battle. But General French, the BS commander, had refused this kind invitation. And this attitude of General French had caused a lot of concern. General French had in fact wished to withdraw the BEF from the war almost for a matter of 8 days to rest and re-equip. And the French government got so alarmed by French's lack of cooperation that Kitchener had been called across from London to talk with General French. And there General French was instructed to keep the BEF in the line and to conform to the movements of the French army. The retreat, 30th and 31st of August, two really crucial events besides Kitchener's intervention now began to affect the movements of the BEF. First, Joffre on the 25th of August had begun putting together a new French army, the 6th, in the area of Amiens and Paris. It had been drawn from way over to the east, beyond Verdun, up to the French border. And the second crucial event, General Kluck, commander of the German First Army, instead of continuing his sweep southwest as ordered, which might have caught within it the new French Sixth Army and the BEF, on the 31st wheeled to the southeast to help complete the supposed destruction of the French Fifth Army at Guise and to conform with German army movements to his east. Now we come to the last of the retreat during the 1st to the 5th of September. The retreat continued in scorching weather. The French and Germans were as or more exhausted than the BEF, and of course the Germans had marched much further, and also their logistics were just not able to cope anymore. For example, their cavalry could not obtain replacement horseshoes. Nevertheless, the Germans continued their advance, but now more or less due south. On the 1st of September at Neri, which is shown on the map, the gunners won 3 VCs. The 1st Cavalry Brigade and L Battery were bivouacked there, and, unknown to them, the German 4th Cavalry Division was also bivouacked within a mile. The morning dawned with dense mist. Both sides were taken by surprise but quickly engaged. L Battery was soon outgunned and all its guns silenced. At about 8 o'clock, when the mist was thinning, our 4th Cavalry Brigade with its artillery arrived. Within an hour, it was all over. The German cavalry division was more or less destroyed and many of its guns captured. This was yet another example of the superiority of the British cavalry. This little battle was the last the BEF had before its retreat ended on the 5th of September. A summary of the retreat. The BEF had not disintegrated despite the length of this retreat, about 200 miles. When it had engaged the enemy, it had held its own, inflicted heavy casualties, and then marched off in good order. By some, it is thought that the BEF could have done more to assist the French, particularly in their battle at Guise. But one should bear in mind instructions given by General Joffre to General French to husband his forces, and from London to minimise his losses. Even so, about 15,000 men have been lost so far out of the original 100,000. The genesis of the Battle of the Marne. The happy opportunity to cease retreating and turn to the offensive can be said to be the result of, on the German side, their exhaustion. They had after all marched much further than the BEF and the French, their underestimation of French resistance, reduction of forces available to implement the Schlieffen Plan, logistic difficulties, especially the inadequate railway capacity through Belgium, and insufficient control of their armies by High Command. On the Allied side, excellent generalship by Joffre, including keeping his nerve, keeping control of his forces, sensitive handling of General French, remedying glaring tactical faults, and dismissal of many of his incompetent army, corps and divisional commanders. As late as the 2nd of September, the day the French government left Paris, Joffre had considered retiring to the Seine, but he was now getting very accurate and complete information on enemy movements from his airmen. By the 4th, Joffre had the agreement of all concerned. His 5th and 6th armies and the BEF would turn to the offensive on the 6th to take advantage of the favourable situation presented by the exposure of the weak right or western flank of the German First Army. The Battle of the Marne, 6th to 9th September. On the 6th, on the west, the French 6th Army advance forced some of the German First Army to withdraw in order to counter this move. This opened a gap of 30 miles between the two wings of the First Army into which the BEF advanced, virtually unopposed. Towards the east, the 5th French Army also started to advance. On the 7th, the French 6th Army was heavily engaged and not able to advance further. But the BEF continued its advance against light opposition, seeing much evidence of German loss of morale, i.e. kit abandoned and drunkenness. The east wing of the German First Army force marched back to reinforce its west wing. Their Second Army attempted an advance but mainly stayed on the defensive. Strangely enough, no orders of any kind were issued by the German High Command on the 6th or the 7th, and the French 5th Army made slight advances. On the 8th, the French 6th Army could barely hold their positions. The BEF continued its advance, but against increasing opposition. The German First Army mainly directed its reinforcements to the BEF's area. Their Second Army had a day of varied fortunes. The German High Command, at last worried by the gap between their First and Second Armies, still issued no orders to them, but instead sent a staff officer, Lieutenant Colonel Hensch, by car from Luxembourg to the 5th, 4th, 3rd, 2nd and 1st Armies in that order to assess the situation and with instructions that should a rearward movement have already been initiated on the right wing, that is their 1st and 2nd Armies, he should endeavour to direct them so that the gap between these armies is closed again. The French 5th Army made a small advance against light opposition. On the 9th, the French 6th Army's left or north flank was pushed back. The BEF continued its advance, crossing the Marne in strength, into the 30-mile gap between the German armies. The BEF's casualties during the Marne were only 1,700. Lieutenant Colonel Hensch had agreed with the 2nd Army on the 8th that it should go back only if the enemy actually crossed the Marne in considerable strength. On the 9th, he had discussions with 1st Army. Since the Marne was known to have been crossed in strength by the BEF, he gave orders for 1st and 2nd Armies to retire in the direction of Soissons. There is nothing significant to report on the French 5th Army. It should be noted that on the 9th, the Belgian army sorted from Antwerp with the express intention of giving the Germans something more to worry about during the decisive Battle of the Marne. This sortie did draw in German forces, but not actually those involved in the Marne. To summarise the Battle of the Marne, while tactically not fought to finish, strategically its results were far-reaching. The advance of the BEF into the big gap between the two German armies, which forced their retirement, really ended their hope of knocking France quickly out of the war, i.e. within 42 days. You could almost say the war from then on was lost for them. They had no plan B. The pursuit to the Aisne, 10th to the 12th September. First, the German situation. On the 10th, the German 1st and 2nd Armies were ordered back to the Aisne, where they were to stand on the defensive until the new 7th Army could be assembled on their right or west. They were absolutely exhausted. Their morale was rock bottom and they were deficient in supplies. Their 2nd Army was reported to be burnt out to a cinder. They withdrew over the intervening river lines without offering any serious opposition and failing to demolish the bridges. The Allies hardly interfered with their withdrawal was they could not catch them up. The French situation. Their 5th and 6th armies advanced against very limited opposition. The country was empty until the 12th, when the resistance stiffened. And how did the BEF get on? Well, the weather was appalling, and they slowed the advance and made aerial reconnaissance unproductive. The BEF came across many stragglers and abandoned equipment. The BEF took many prisoners and had a few skirmishes. There are indications that the Germans would stand on the Aisne and the Chemin des Dames position. This is immensely strong, and it was to defeat massive French attacks in 1917 which led to their mutiny. The Battle of the Aisne, 13th to the 30th September. On the 13th, the Allies managed to cross the Aisne River in places, sometimes only in single file over partially demolished bridges, and established bridgeheads. In these they more or less remained, as shown on the map, until the battle slowly died away as the end of the month approached. The terrain favoured the defence. The river was unfordable and all the bridges were down. The valley itself was flat and devoid of cover, and on its north side it rose to the east-west Chemin des Dames ridge, which gave the Germans good observation and from which ravines and wooded spurs ran down to the river. German reinforcements arrived, on occasions only by 2 hours in time, to prevent the Allies breaking through the gap which had existed between their 1st and 2nd armies. Well, the weather remained foul until the 20th, but the BEF made many attacks, and these were usually unsuccessful and all hideously costly, sometimes more so than on the Somme. And the opposition made many counterattacks, as was their wont, and usually with the same result. And our cavalry, fighting dismounted, was often involved in restoring the situation. And after the 15th, the situation became deadlocked, and the BEF was ordered to entrench. But remarkably, neither army was prepared for it, despite examples from the American Civil and Russo-Japanese wars. The Germans were more prepared for it, though, because of their preparations for siege warfare, i.e. at Liège. Nevertheless, it wasn't until about the 14th of September that their first trainload of engineer stores, i.e. trench warfare stuff, arrived. And it was not until the 27th that they first used hand grenades or bombs against us, to which we could only respond with homemade devices, i.e. jam jars filled with nails. Well, the BEF built only a very rudimentary succession of funkholes or excavations into the sides of the slopes. And initially, of course, no barbed wire was available, so they nicked wire from the farmers' fields. Well, their artillery had the upper hand to start with. This was due to the terrain which favoured them. Remember, they were on the ridge with their guns behind it, and we were on the forward slopes and in the valley, flat valley beyond it. It was also due to his artillery observers, who showed much enterprise. They were frequently found behind our lines in haystacks or up trees, or even disguised as farmers, and somehow with telephone communications to their guns. And also, the German artillery is more suited to the job. They had more howitzers, which were capable of firing over hills, and more heavies. Our artillery began to compete on more equal terms. 8 6-inch howitzers arrived, dummy batteries were created, and our artillery observers began to go up in Royal Flying Corps aircraft, which were just beginning to be fitted with rudimentary wireless. I say rudimentary because it was air to ground and Morse only. Nevertheless, the BEF still lost 13,500 men at the Aisne, over 10% of its strength. The Battle of the Aisne now over, I'd like to cover just a few happenings before we come to the great race to the sea. The first of these happenings was that on the 14th of September, the German army had a new commander-in-chief. Moltke, worn out and demoralised, was replaced by Falkenhayn, who in due course would be replaced by Hindenburg and Ludendorff in 1916. The German plan was now, when sufficient new forces became available, to attack south from Arras, and this started on October 2nd and failed. A huge cavalry force was to sweep across Flanders to the coast. This also failed. And they were to capture Antwerp before the Allies could extend their line to join up with the Belgians there. This eventually succeeded around 11th of October. Interestingly, during September, Joffre had built up his left or west flank in the general area west of Soissons and north of Paris, in order to envelop the German right or west flank, which was then weak. He later made further attempts to do this, always further north as the Germans continued to thwart him. Thus began the race to the sea, which was the extension of the Allied line from around the area of Soissons and the Aisne battlefield. By the 15th of September, it had reached Noyon. By the 24th, it was on the Somme. By the 28th, at Bapaume. 1st of October, at Lens. The 8th, at Hazebrouck. And on the 14th of October, it finally reached the coast. While this race was going on, the German threat to Antwerp increased. To help defend it, we sent, around the 6th to 9th of October, the Naval Division, and via Ostend and Ghent, the 7th Division and the 3rd Cavalry Division, and Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty. However, the city fell on the 11th, and as a result, the Naval Division was withdrawn by train, and the 7th Division and the cavalry retired to Ypres, and the Belgian army to the area of Nieuwpoort on the coast, where they formed the end of the Allied line for the rest of the war. During October and November, the BEF received reinforcements. Some as individuals, but these were often too young or too old and untrained, but also more usefully. The 7th Division and the cavalry from Antwerp on the 14th of October, the Indian Corps of 2 divisions and some cavalry by the 23rd, and the 8th Division on 13th November. And the 7th and 8th Divisions were to form 4th Corps. Towards the end of September, the BEF's commander, General French, had suggested to Joffre that the BEF should be transferred to the left or west of their Allied line to shorten and simplify its line of communication to the Channel ports. This was agreed, and the move started on the night of the 1st October and was so well concealed that the Germans did not deduce what was going on until the 8th. The BEF, that is 1, 2 and the more recently formed 3 Corps, had completed this move, that is from the Aisne to Flanders, by October the 20th. The BEF's war in October and November 1914. Between the middle of October and in the first half of November, the BEF fought desperate battles around Messines and Ypres. And it only just held on, especially around Ypres, with the cavalry dismounted and our last reserves, cooks and bottle washers and even staff officers, being put into the line. The Germans had committed their crack troops, the Guards, but they still had not succeeded. This marked the last German attempt to break through the Allied line until March 1918, with the possible exception of Verdun in 1916. After 11th November, the fighting reduced and everyone settled down to a miserable life in freezing and flooded trenches. A summary of the First Yeats battle. It was nearly lost, partly due to our shortage of artillery ammunition. It cost us 58,000 casualties, thus almost completing the total destruction of the original BEF which had gone to France in August, 100,000 strong. But the line just held. And this may be partly due to the generalship of Haig, one corps commander. This certainly established his reputation and led to him being selected to take over command of the BEF from French in December 1915. And this now completes our story of the BEF's battles in 1914, while our volunteers were being trained here in the Wylye Valley.